The rain hammered against the windshield as Jason Martinez sat in his beat-up Honda Civic, waiting for his next ride request to ping through the Uber app. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Saturday night in downtown Chicago, and the streets glistened with neon reflections from the high-rise hotels and exclusive venues that lined Michigan Avenue. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His phone buzzed with a pickup request from the Grand Millennium Hotel, one of those five-star places where Jason had dropped off countless wealthy passengers over the past 3 years of driving nights to make ends meet. What he didn't expect was to see a woman in a torn wedding dress stumbling out of the marble lobby, mascara streaming down her cheeks, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Jason had been driving for Uber for 3 years now, ever since his ex-wife Rebecca had walked out on him and their 7-year-old son Danny, claiming she couldn't handle the stress of being married to a construction worker who was, quote, going nowhere in life. The divorce had wiped out his savings, and when a back injury forced him off the construction sites, he'd turned to driving nights while Danny slept, picking up weekend shifts that stretched until dawn. His days were spent being a single father, packing lunches, helping with homework, and trying to be both mom and dad to a kid who still asked when mommy was coming home. The woman who slid into his back seat that night was nothing like his usual passengers. She was breathtaking, even in her disheveled state, with long auburn hair that had escaped its elaborate updo and emerald eyes that seemed to hold oceans of pain. Her wedding dress, which probably cost more than Jason made in 6 months, was muddy at the hem and torn at the shoulder. She gave him an address in Lincoln Park, one of those neighborhoods where Jason delivered food but never imagined actually living. "Please just drive," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I can't go back there. I can't marry him." Jason glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her hands shaking as she tried to wipe away her tears with what remained of her makeup. Something about her vulnerability reminded him of Danny during those first terrible nights after Rebecca left, when his son would crawl into bed with him, asking why people leave when they promise to stay forever. "You okay back there?" Jason asked gently, the same tone he used when Danny had nightmares. "Need me to stop anywhere? Get you some water or something?" The woman looked up, surprised by his kindness. Most Uber drivers, she realized, would have either ignored her distress or been too intimidated by her obvious wealth to acknowledge her as anything more than a fare. "I'm Elena," she said after a moment, as if testing whether her own name still belonged to her. "Elena Morrison." Jason recognized the name immediately from the business sections of newspapers and local news. Morrison Tech Industries, one of Chicago's biggest success stories, founded by her late father and now worth billions. She was supposed to marry Richard Blackstone tonight, the merger king whose face appeared on magazine covers next to headlines about corporate acquisitions and political influence. "Jason Martinez," he replied, taking the Lakeshore Drive exit. "And for what it's worth, anyone who makes you cry like that on what's supposed to be the happiest day of your life probably isn't worth marrying." Elena let out a bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. "You have no idea how right you are." The drive to Lincoln Park usually took 20 minutes, but Jason found himself taking the longer route along the lakefront, sensing that Elena needed time to collect herself before facing whatever waited at her destination. "This is going to sound crazy," Elena said suddenly, leaning forward in her seat. "But have we met before? You look familiar." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Jason's heart skipped a beat because he remembered exactly where they'd met, even if she might not. 6 months ago, he'd been at Children's Memorial Hospital with Danny, who was having his annual checkup for the heart condition he'd been born with. Elena had been there too, not as a patient but visiting the pediatric ward as part of some charity work. Danny had been fascinated by her kindness with the sick children, and when she'd noticed his Pokemon cards, she'd sat down and learned the entire game just to play with him for an hour. "Yeah," Jason said quietly. "Children's Memorial. You played Pokemon with my son Danny. You probably don't remember, but you made his whole month." In the rearview mirror, he saw Elena's expression change completely, recognition flooding her features. Danny with the heart condition and the beautiful smile, she said softly. He taught me about Charizard cards and told me his dad was a superhero who worked construction by day and drove people safely home at night. You're that, Jason. The silence in the car stretched for several heartbeats as the memory of that day at Children's Memorial hung between them. Jason remembered how Elena had looked in the pediatric ward, so different from the polished businesswoman he'd seen in magazines. She'd worn simple jeans and a sweater, her hair in a messy ponytail, and she'd gotten down on the floor with the kids without worrying about her clothes. Danny had been having a rough day after his tests, withdrawn and scared, but Elena had somehow coaxed him out of his shell with genuine interest in his card collection. "I can't believe it's you," Elena said, her voice filled with wonder. "Danny asked me if I had any kids, and when I said no, he told me I'd make a great mom because I listened like his dad did. He was so proud when he talked about you." Jason felt his chest tighten with emotion. Danny rarely opened up to strangers, especially after Rebecca left, but something about Elena had reached him that day. "He still talks about the lady who learned Pokemon just for him," Jason said, navigating through the quieter streets of Lincoln Park. "He's been asking me to take him back to visit the other kids, but between work and everything else." He trailed off, not wanting to burden her with his financial struggles. Elena nodded understanding, recognizing the weight of single parenthood even from her privileged position. "Turn here," she directed softly, pointing to a tree-lined street filled with elegant brownstones, the third one with the blue door. As they pulled up to what Jason realized was a modest apartment building, quite different from the mansion he'd expected, Elena made no move to get out of the car. Instead, she sat staring at her hands, still adorned with an engagement ring that probably cost more than Jason's annual income. "This isn't what you expected, is it?" she asked, noticing his confusion. "Richard wanted me to sell this place after we got engaged. Said it wasn't appropriate for someone of my status to live in a simple two-bedroom apartment. But this was my first home after college, the first place that was truly mine, not my father's or the company's." She twisted the ring on her finger, and Jason could see the internal battle playing out across her features. "Why did you run?" Jason asked gently, turning off the engine. The rain had slowed to a gentle patter, and the streetlights cast a warm glow through the car windows. Elena looked up at him through the rearview mirror, and, for a moment, she looked like a lost child rather than a billionaire heiress. "Because I realized I was about to marry a man who doesn't know me at all," she said quietly. "Richard proposed during a board meeting, surrounded by investors and cameras. He had a whole speech prepared about merging our companies and creating a tech empire. Everyone applauded, and I said yes because it seemed like what I was supposed to do. But tonight, as I was walking down the aisle, I kept thinking about Danny asking me why I didn't have kids. And I realized it's because I've never had a real relationship, never been with someone who saw me as Elena instead of the Morrison fortune." Jason turned in his seat to face her properly. "So what changed tonight? What made you run?" Elena smiled sadly, pulling her phone out of her purse. She showed him a text message from Richard sent just an hour before the ceremony. It read, "Remember, no deviations from the script during your vows. Stick to what we practiced. This is about the companies, not emotions." "That's when I knew I couldn't do it," she continued. "I was about to promise to love a man who just texted me instructions for my wedding vows. A man who's never asked me what I dream about, what scares me, or what makes me laugh. He knows my stock portfolio better than he knows my favorite color." Jason felt anger rising in his chest on her behalf. He thought about how Rebecca used to complain that he wasn't ambitious enough. But at least he'd known she loved purple flowers and hated scary movies and cried during commercials with dogs. "What's your favorite color?" he asked impulsively. Elena blinked in surprise, then laughed, a real laugh this time instead of the bitter sound from earlier. "Green," she said. "Forest green, like the trees at my grandmother's cabin in Wisconsin. She left it to me, and it's the only place where no one expects me to be anyone but myself." They talked for another hour in that car, rain drumming softly on the roof while Elena told him about the pressure of living up to her father's legacy, the loneliness of never knowing if people liked her or her money, and the crushing weight of everyone's expectations. Jason shared his own struggles with single parenthood, the guilt of working nights when Danny needed him, and the fear that he wasn't enough for his son without a mother in the picture. "Danny's lucky to have you," Elena said when Jason mentioned his worries about being a good enough parent. "I could see it that day at the hospital. The way you looked at him, the way you protected him, without making him feel fragile. My father loved me, but he was always so busy building the company that we barely spent time together. I would have given anything to have a parent who was present like you are." As the night grew later, Jason realized he should probably head home to relieve Mrs. Chen, the elderly neighbor who watched Danny when he worked weekend nights. But something about this conversation, the easy connection he felt with Elena, made him reluctant to end it. It had been years since he'd talked to another adult about anything deeper than pickup locations and traffic conditions. "I should let you go," Elena said, seeming to read his thoughts. "You probably have to get home to Danny." She reached for her purse, but Jason stopped her. "This one's on me," he said. "Consider it a favor between friends." Elena's eyes filled with tears again, but these seemed different from the desperate sobs when she'd first gotten in his car. "Friends?" she repeated softly. "I don't think I've had a real friend in years." She paused, then looked at him with something that might have been hope. "Jason, would it be completely inappropriate if I asked to see you again? Not as a passenger, just as Elena. I know we're from different worlds, but that day at the hospital, talking with you and Danny, it was the most real I'd felt in months." Jason's heart raced as he considered what she was asking. A friendship with Elena Morrison seemed impossible, the kind of thing that only happened in movies. But then he remembered how she'd sat on that hospital floor, genuinely caring about his son's card collection, treating Danny like he mattered. Maybe different worlds didn't have to mean they couldn't find common ground. "Danny has a baseball game next Saturday at noon," he heard himself saying. "Lincoln Elementary, Field 2. If you're not too busy running a tech empire, he'd probably love to see his Pokemon teacher again." Elena's face lit up with a smile that transformed her completely, making her look years younger and infinitely more beautiful than any magazine photo Jason had ever seen. "I'll be there," she promised, and Jason believed her. As she finally stepped out of the car and walked toward her building, still in her torn wedding dress but carrying herself with new purpose, Jason realized that this night had changed something fundamental in both their lives. He sat there for a few more minutes, watching her disappear into the building, wondering what he'd just set in motion and whether he was brave enough to see where it might lead. Saturday morning arrived with perfect baseball weather, and Jason found himself checking his watch every few minutes as he helped Danny warm up on the field. The other parents were setting up folding chairs along the sidelines, coolers filled with juice boxes and orange slices that would fuel the team through 9 innings of enthusiastic but chaotic 7-year-old baseball. Jason had barely slept the night before, alternating between excitement and doubt about whether Elena would actually show up to a Little League game in a working-class neighborhood. Danny had been talking non-stop about the possibility of seeing, quote, the nice lady from the hospital again ever since Jason had casually mentioned she might come watch his game. The boy had changed his shirt 3 times that morning, finally settling on his lucky jersey with the number 7, and had spent an extra 10 minutes making sure his cleats were perfectly clean. Jason recognized his own nervous energy, reflected in his son's behavior. At 5 minutes past noon, just as the umpire was calling the teams to their positions, a sleek black sedan pulled into the gravel parking lot. Jason's heart stopped when he saw Elena step out, but not because of her arrival. She was dressed in designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail, and she was accompanied by 2 men in expensive suits who scanned the area like Secret Service agents. The contrast between Elena and the other parents was immediate and jarring. While the other moms and dads wore team t-shirts and comfortable sneakers, Elena looked like she'd stepped off the pages of a luxury lifestyle magazine. The security detail took positions near the parking lot, their presence creating an invisible barrier that made Jason's stomach sink with realization. This wasn't Elena coming as a friend to watch Danny play. This was Elena Morrison, billionaire heiress, making an appearance. Danny spotted her immediately and waved enthusiastically from his position at second base, calling out, "Hi, Elena!" loud enough that several parents turned to look. Jason watched Elena's face light up with genuine warmth as she waved back, but he also noticed how the other parents began whispering among themselves, phones appearing as they realized they were in the presence of Chicago royalty. "Is that really Elena Morrison?" asked Sarah Chen, the mother of Danny's teammate Marcus. "I saw her on the news this morning." Something about calling off her wedding to Richard Blackstone at the last minute. The business world is going crazy trying to figure out what happened to the merger. Jason felt his blood turn cold. He hadn't thought about the media attention Elena's runaway bride situation would generate. Hadn't considered that her presence at Danny's game might turn into a circus. As if summoned by his worst fears, Jason noticed a white van with Channel 7 news markings pulling into the far end of the parking lot. Then, another from a different station. Within minutes, reporters with cameras were setting up along the street, trying to get clear shots of Elena while staying on public property. The security team immediately moved into defensive positions, speaking rapidly into their earpieces. The game began, but Jason could barely focus on Danny's at-bats or defensive plays. He was too aware of Elena sitting alone on the bleachers, other parents giving her a wide berth out of either respect or intimidation. She cheered enthusiastically for Danny and the other kids. But Jason could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the growing media presence beyond the field. During the third inning stretch, Elena approached Jason near the dugout where he was helping distribute water bottles to the players. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly, her voice thick with regret. "I didn't think about the attention this would bring. I should have considered what my being here might mean for you and Danny." Jason wanted to reassure her, to say it didn't matter, but the truth was that it did matter. Already he could see some of the other parents looking at him differently, calculating what his connection to Elena Morrison might mean. Mrs. Patterson, Danny's second-grade teacher who helped with the team, kept shooting curious glances their way, and Jason knew there would be questions at school on Monday. "It's not your fault," Jason said, though his voice carried more strain than he intended. "You have a right to live your life." But even as he said it, he realized how naive he'd been to think their friendship could exist in some kind of bubble, separate from the reality of Elena's public profile and wealth. The situation deteriorated during the fifth inning, when Danny hit his first double of the season and ran excitedly toward the stands to share his triumph with Elena. Without thinking, she hugged him and lifted him up in celebration, and the cameras beyond the fence captured every moment. Jason watched it happen in slow motion, knowing that by evening, photos of Elena Morrison embracing his son would be plastered across social media and entertainment news websites. "Daddy, why are there so many cameras?" Danny asked when he returned to the dugout, his initial excitement dampened by confusion. Several of his teammates were also asking questions, their parents having pointed out the media presence. Jason knelt down to Danny's eye level, struggling to find words that would make sense to a 7-year-old. "Sometimes when people are famous, photographers follow them around," Jason explained carefully. "Elena is very important in business, so people are interested in what she does." Danny considered this with the serious expression he wore when trying to understand adult concepts that didn't quite make sense to him. "Does that mean she can't be our friend anymore?" Danny asked, and the innocent question hit Jason like a physical blow, because that was exactly what it meant, wasn't it? Elena's world of boardrooms and media scrutiny and security details couldn't coexist with their simple life of baseball games and homework help and bedtime stories. After the game, which Danny's team won by 2 runs, largely thanks to his game-winning hit, Elena approached them again as Jason was packing up Danny's equipment. The security team maintained their perimeter, and the media presence had grown to include reporters from 3 local stations and what looked like a freelance photographer with a telephoto lens. "I want to explain something to both of you," Elena said, crouching down so she was at Danny's height. "I had a wonderful time watching you play today, and I'm so proud of how well you did. But there are some people who are very interested in my life right now because of some decisions I made, and that attention might make things complicated for you and your dad." Danny nodded solemnly, though Jason could see he didn't fully understand. "Are you in trouble?" the boy asked with characteristic directness. Elena smiled sadly, reaching out to adjust Danny's baseball cap. "Not trouble exactly, but people are very curious about my life, and sometimes that curiosity can make things difficult for my friends." Jason felt the weight of what she wasn't saying. The unspoken acknowledgement that their friendship, whatever it might have become, was impossible given the circumstances. Elena Morrison couldn't have casual friendships with Uber drivers without it becoming a media story, and Jason couldn't expose Danny to that kind of scrutiny. I think it might be best if I don't come to any more games for a while. Elena continued, her voice carefully controlled. Just until things calm down a bit. Quote, Jason appreciated that she was trying to make it sound temporary, but they both knew better. The media attention might die down, but Elena would always be Elena Morrison, and he would always be the single dad driving nights to make ends meet. As they walked toward the parking lot, Danny between them, Jason struggled with feelings he couldn't quite name. Disappointment, certainly, but also a strange sense of loss for something that had barely begun. For a few days, he'd allowed himself to imagine that different worlds could somehow find common ground, that genuine connection could bridge any gap. But reality had intruded with cameras and security teams and the harsh truth that some divides were simply too wide to cross. Elena's sedan was waiting, engine running, security team already in position. She turned to Danny one more time, pulling a small wrapped package from her purse. I brought you something, she said. A special Pokémon card I thought you might like. Danny unwrapped it with careful fingers, revealing a holographic Charizard that made his eyes widen with wonder. Thank you, he whispered, then looked up at her with the devastating honesty that only children possess. Will I see you again? Elena's composure finally cracked slightly, and Jason saw her eyes fill with tears she was fighting to control. I hope so, sweetheart, she said softly. Someday, when things are different. As her car pulled away, followed discreetly by the media vehicles, Jason stood with his arm around Danny's shoulders, watching until the taillights disappeared around the corner. The other families had already left. The field was empty except for the groundskeeper collecting the bases, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the diamond where, for a few hours, he'd almost believed in the impossible. 3 weeks after the baseball game, Jason's life had returned to its familiar rhythm of early mornings with Danny, afternoon pickups from school, and long nights driving strangers through Chicago's streets. But the normalcy felt hollow, like going through the motions of a life that no longer quite fit. Danny had stopped asking when Elena might visit again, though Jason caught him sometimes staring at the holographic Charizard card she'd given him, turning it over in his small hands with a wistful expression that broke Jason's heart. The media storm around Elena's canceled wedding had eventually died down, replaced by newer scandals and fresher gossip, but the damage to Jason's peace of mind lingered. He'd seen the photos online, despite trying to avoid them, pictures of Elena hugging Danny with headlines speculating about her mysterious new relationship and, quote, secret family. The comments sections had been brutal, filled with theories about gold diggers and ulterior motives that made Jason's stomach turn with their cruelty. It was a Thursday night, nearly midnight, when Jason's phone buzzed with a ride request that made his hands freeze on the steering wheel. The pickup location was Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and something about the timing and place sent ice through his veins. He'd learned to trust his instincts over the years of night driving, and every instinct was screaming that this wasn't a routine pickup. When he arrived at the hospital's main entrance, he immediately spotted Elena pacing near the valet station, still wearing what looked like a business suit, but rumpled and disheveled. Her hair had escaped its usual perfect styling, and even from a distance, Jason could see the tension radiating from her small frame. She slipped into his backseat without meeting his eyes, giving him an address he didn't recognize in a part of town he rarely visited. Elena, what's wrong? Jason asked immediately, abandoning any pretense of professional driver distance. Are you hurt? Do you need me to take you somewhere else? She shook her head, finally looking up to meet his gaze in the rearview mirror. And Jason saw exhaustion and defeat in her expression that went far deeper than physical tiredness. My grandmother, Elena said quietly. She had a stroke this afternoon. I've been at the hospital since 3 o'clock, and the doctors just told me there's nothing more they can do. She's gone, Jason. Her voice broke on the last word, and Jason immediately pulled over into the nearest parking lot, turning off the engine and getting out to open her door. Come here, he said simply, and Elena collapsed into his arms without hesitation, sobbing against his chest with the raw grief of someone who had been holding herself together for hours and finally had permission to break down. Jason held her tightly, one hand stroking her hair while she cried, not caring about the expensive fabric of her suit or the fact that they were standing in a random parking lot at midnight. She was the only family I had left who knew me as just Elena, she whispered between sobs. Not the company heiress or the Morrison name or any of that. Just the granddaughter who loved coming to her cabin in Wisconsin and learning to fish and playing card games on rainy afternoons. She never cared about the business or the money. She just wanted to know if I was happy, and I could never tell her the truth because I didn't know the answer myself. Jason guided her back into the car, this time sitting in the back seat beside her instead of returning to the driver's seat. Elena curled into his side like a wounded animal seeking warmth, and he wrapped his arms around her protectively while she continued to cry. The address she'd given him was forgotten as they sat in the darkness, Jason letting her grieve without trying to fix anything or offer empty platitudes. "The last conversation we had was 2 weeks ago," Elena continued when her tears had slowed enough for words. "She called to ask about the wedding, and I had to tell her I'd canceled it. Instead of being disappointed or worried about the business implications, she just said she was proud of me for choosing my heart over expectations. She said she'd been praying for years that I'd find the courage to live my own life instead of the one everyone else had planned for me." Jason felt the weight of Elena's grief settling over both of them like a heavy blanket. He thought about his own grandmother, who had died when Danny was just a baby, and how he still sometimes reached for his phone to call her when something wonderful or terrible happened. The people who love us unconditionally, who see us as we truly are irreplaceable when they're gone. "Where did you want me to take you?" Jason asked gently when Elena had been quiet for several minutes. She stirred against his shoulder, seeming to remember where they were and why she'd called for a ride in the first place. "The cabin," she said. "It's about 3 hours north of here, near a little town called Cedar Falls. I know it's a long drive, and I can pay you whatever you think is fair, but I can't go back to my apartment tonight. I can't face the empty space and the silence and all the sympathy calls that are probably already starting to come in." Jason didn't hesitate. "I'll take you wherever you need to go," he said, meaning it completely. He thought briefly about Danny, safely asleep at Mrs. Chen's apartment after their usual Thursday night arrangement, and calculated that he could make the drive and be back before his son woke up for school. Some things were more important than logistics. The drive to Cedar Falls passed mostly in comfortable silence, Elena occasionally giving quiet directions while Jason navigated the increasingly rural roads. She'd stopped crying, but Jason could feel the sadness radiating from her like heat from a fever. Sometimes she would tell him a memory about her grandmother, random stories that seemed to bubble up without warning. How Grandma Rose had taught her to drive stick shift in the pasture behind the cabin when she was 14. How they'd spent an entire summer building birdhouses that were so crooked no bird would use them, but they'd hung them up anyway and pretended not to notice. "She left me the cabin in her will," Elena said as they turned onto a gravel road lined with tall pines. "My lawyers have been trying to convince me to sell it for years, saying it's not a good investment and the upkeep isn't worth it for a place I only visit a few times a year. But I could never bring myself to let it go. It was the only place where I felt like myself." The cabin appeared through the trees like something from a fairy tale, a modest log structure with a wraparound porch and flower boxes under the windows. It wasn't large or fancy, but it had the kind of weathered charm that spoke of decades of love and care. Elena's hands shook as she unlocked the front door, and Jason followed her inside, immediately struck by the warmth and personality of the space. The walls were covered with family photos, spanning generations, handmade quilts draped over furniture that had seen better days but was clearly cherished, and bookshelves stuffed with everything from classic literature to gardening magazines. It felt like a real home in a way that Elena's pristine apartment never had, lived in and loved, and completely unpretentious. "She was supposed to teach me her pie crust recipe this summer," Elena said, running her fingers over the worn wooden countertop in the kitchen. "I kept putting it off because I was always too busy with meetings and acquisitions and board presentations. Now I'll never know if I could have made pies like hers." Jason watched Elena move through the cabin like a ghost, touching familiar objects and disappearing into memories he couldn't share. When she finally sank onto the couch, looking small and lost in the oversized space, he made a decision that surprised them both. "Call Danny's school," he said quietly. "Tell him he's taking a sick day. I'm staying with you tonight, and tomorrow we're going to figure out how to make that pie crust recipe. Your grandmother probably wrote it down somewhere, and if she didn't, we'll call every elderly woman in Cedar Falls until we find someone who learned it from her." Elena looked up at him with surprise, and something that might have been hope. "You can't stay here, Jason. You have responsibilities, and I can't ask you to abandon your life for my grief." But Jason was already pulling out his phone to text Mrs. Chen, asking if she could handle Danny's morning routine one more time. "You're not asking," he said simply. "I'm choosing. Sometimes people need to not be alone, and sometimes the choice isn't between right and wrong, but between kind and unkind. You were kind to my son when you didn't have to be, and you've been kind to me in ways I'm still figuring out how to appreciate. Let me be kind to you now, when you need it most." Elena's eyes filled with tears again, but these seemed different from the desperate grief she'd shown at the hospital. "I don't know how to let people take care of me," she admitted. "I've been taking care of everyone else for so long, making decisions and solving problems and being strong for the company and the employees and everyone who depends on Morrison Tech. I don't remember how to be vulnerable." Jason sat down beside her on the couch, close enough that their knees touched, and took her hands in his. "You don't have to remember how," he said. "You just have to let it happen. Let me make you some tea and find you something comfortable to wear and sit with you while you cry if you need to cry. Tomorrow we'll tackle the pie crust, but tonight you just need to breathe and remember that grief is love with nowhere to go." For the first time since she'd gotten into his car hours earlier, Elena smiled through her tears. "How did you get so wise about loss?" she asked. Jason thought about Rebecca leaving, about the nights he'd sat in Danny's room watching his son sleep and wondering how to explain why people sometimes break promises they mean to keep. Single parenting is mostly about learning to hold space for someone else's feelings while managing your own, he said. And losing people teaches you that the only way through grief is to stop trying to go around it. Elena nodded, understanding passing between them that went deeper than words, and for the first time in weeks, Jason felt like they were exactly where they were supposed to be. 6 months later, Jason stood in the kitchen of Rose's cabin, flour dusting his hands as he watched Elena roll out pie dough with the concentrated focus of someone who had finally mastered a skill that had once seemed impossible. The recipe had been tucked inside her grandmother's favorite cookbook, written in faded blue ink with notes scribbled in the margins about humidity and oven temperatures. It had taken them 17 attempts that first weekend to produce anything remotely edible, but Elena had refused to give up, treating each failed crust like a puzzle to be solved rather than a defeat to be mourned. Danny burst through the screen door carrying a string of fish, his face glowing with the pride of a successful morning on the lake with Marcus Chen, who had become their weekend fishing companion since Elena had quietly arranged for the Chen family to join them at the cabin during school breaks. The simple gesture had solved Jason's childcare challenges while giving Danny the male friendship he craved, and it was typical of Elena's way of fixing problems without making anyone feel like charity cases. "Dad, look what I caught," Danny announced, holding up a respectable base that would become their lunch. "Marcus says I'm getting really good at reading the water." Elena smiled at the boy's enthusiasm, her hands never pausing in their steady rhythm as she prepared what had become her signature dessert for their Sunday dinners together. The past 6 months had transformed all their lives in ways none of them could have predicted. Elena had stepped back from the daily operations of Morrison Tech, promoting her most trusted lieutenant to CEO while retaining her position as board chair. The decision had sent shockwaves through the business community, but Elena had faced the criticism with a calm certainty that surprised everyone who knew her. She spent 3 days a week in Chicago handling essential business, but Thursday through Sunday belonged to the cabin, to the life she was building away from boardrooms and quarterly reports. Jason had quit driving for Uber entirely, using Elena's generous payment for that long-ago midnight drive to Cedar Falls as seed money for his own small construction business. He specialized in cabin and cottage renovations throughout the region, work that kept him close to home and allowed him to be present for Danny's school events and weekend adventures. The irony wasn't lost on him that Elena's wealth had given him the freedom to stop worrying about money and focus on what actually mattered. "The Johnsons want to know if you can look at their dock next week," Elena said, sliding the pie into the oven with practiced ease. The winter ice damage was worse than they thought. Jason nodded, checking his phone calendar. His business had grown through word of mouth among the cabin community, wealthy Chicago families who appreciated his honest pricing and quality work. Elena had never directly recommended him to anyone, understanding instinctively that Jason's pride required him to earn his reputation rather than inherit it through her connections. As they prepared lunch together, moving around the kitchen with the comfortable choreography of people who had learned each other's rhythms, Jason marveled at how natural this life had become. Danny set the table while chattering about his plans to build a treehouse in the massive oak behind the cabin. Elena listened with the genuine interest she brought to everything Danny shared, asking detailed questions about his engineering plans and offering suggestions that took his 7-year-old ideas seriously. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Elena asked quietly while Danny was outside showing Marcus his fishing technique. Tomorrow was the annual Morrison Tech shareholders meeting, Elena's first major public appearance since stepping back from active management. The business press had been speculating for months about her personal life and the mysterious reasons behind her corporate retreat. Jason considered the question carefully. He'd worried initially about the attention their relationship might attract, the way Elena's public profile could complicate their simple happiness. But somewhere between failed pie crusts and successful fishing expeditions, between Danny's laughter echoing across the lake and Elena's gradual transformation from guarded businesswoman to relaxed partner, his fears had faded into irrelevance. "I'm proud of you," he said simply, "for choosing what makes you happy instead of what makes everyone else comfortable." Elena smiled, the genuine expression that had replaced her polished public smile months ago. Tomorrow, she would announce her engagement to Jason Martinez, a carpenter from Chicago, and the business world would have to reconcile their expectations with her reality. The afternoon passed in the lazy contentment that had become their weekend routine. Danny and Marcus built elaborate sand castles on the small beach while Elena and Jason worked on refinishing the cabin's front porch, a project that had been stretching pleasantly across several weekends. As the sun began to set, painting the lake in shades of gold and crimson, Elena called everyone inside for pie and the weekly phone call to Danny's teacher to discuss his homework assignments. Danny had flourished in this new arrangement, his confidence growing alongside his fishing skills and his reading level. The stability of knowing exactly where he'd be every weekend, the security of Elena's presence in their lives, had given him a foundation Jason had never been able to provide alone. Watching his son explain the day's adventures to Mrs. Rodriguez over speakerphone, Jason felt the deep satisfaction of choices that had led somewhere beautiful. Later that evening, after Danny had fallen asleep in the cabin's small loft bedroom, Jason and Elena sat on the porch swing her grandmother had installed decades earlier. The lake stretched before them like black glass, reflecting the stars that were impossible to see in Chicago's light pollution. Elena wore one of Jason's old sweatshirts over her jeans, her hair loose around her shoulders, looking nothing like the polished executive who would address shareholders the following day. "Do you ever miss it?" Jason asked, meaning the adrenaline of corporate power, the rush of billion-dollar decisions and international recognition. Elena considered the question while rocking the swing gently with her foot, a habit she'd developed during their many evening conversations. "I miss feeling important," she said honestly. "But I've learned there's a difference between being important and mattering. At Morrison Tech, I was important to stock prices and market projections and corporate strategies. Here, I matter to Danny's bedtime stories and your morning coffee preferences, and whether the pie crust turns out flaky or tough. It's a smaller world, but it's mine in a way the other never was." Jason reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers with the easy affection that had grown between them like wildflowers, unexpected but perfectly suited to the terrain. Tomorrow would bring shareholders and reporters and probably renewed speculation about Elena Morrison's dramatic life changes. But tonight there was only the lake and the stars and the quiet breathing of a child who felt safe enough to sleep deeply. "So what happens next?" Elena asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Jason smiled, thinking about the ring he'd hidden in his tackle box, the proposal he'd been planning for next weekend when they would be completely alone except for the loons calling across the water. "Next we keep building something real," he said. "One day at a time, one pie crust at a time, one bedtime story at a time. We keep choosing each other and this life we've made, even when it doesn't make sense to anyone else." Elena nestled closer to his side, and Jason felt the rightness of it settle into his bones like warmth from a fire. In the distance, an owl called across the water, and Danny stirred briefly in his sleep before settling back into dreams that probably involved fish and treehouses and the kind of family that finds each other in the most unexpected places. Jason closed his eyes and listened to the gentle lap of waves against the shore, knowing that some stories don't end, so much as they transform into new beginnings, as infinite and promising as the stars reflected in the dark water before them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.